Washington here, and I'm here today with Jake Vazquez, and we're excited to just talk about some very important topics that we all, deal with as it pertains to understanding the faith, as it pertains to sharing the faith. And Jake has been studying this stuff for a really long time. I have as well, but not as much as Jake. Not all of us are on our path to getting our masters in apologetics and things, and so but it's really important that we, make sure that we understand, why we believe what we believe. And it is my sincere opinion that it's okay to challenge our own beliefs. Because if you don't, somebody else will. Jesus told us, to judge ourselves lest we be judged. And obviously, I think he was speaking more in the terms of sin or, lifestyle or different things. But I think it holds true with our ideas and our thoughts and so forth as well. And so, Jake, welcome to your show. How are you today?
Thanks, Steve. No, it's an honor that to be here. That you're doing this, and I think this is great. I have the privilege and the honor of earning my master's at Liberty, but I've also had the honor of sitting in on all these interviews with these guys who are way smarter than I am, and just hearing them and how they address these questions that are really critical in all of our lives. I think every Christian should be aware of. And then you read First Peter 3:15, and it's actually a calling that we're all called to do. So whether you're elementary or you're scholarly, we all have to have reasons for what we believe. But to answer your question, I'm pretty good. No
Good,
complaints.
good, good. Very good to hear. Very good to hear. Well, let's jump right in. One of the most powerful questions, and I think Frank Turek was one of the first people I heard really talk about this. Is just this question of like, what is truth, and is truth exclusive or is it relative? This is a very big question, when it comes to any ideology, so forth. Like, what is truth? So when you think of truth, like, what comes to mind?
Yeah, when I think of truth, and we did an episode recently on what is truth, and the way that it was explained by my guest was just profound. But simply put, truth is what corresponds to reality. Like it's really that simple as to what corresponds to reality. That means if your feelings go against what corresponds to reality, it's false. Now, a lot of people, the biggest objection to truth that you'll hear like on the streets or I see in the comments is there is no truth. But that itself is a truth claim. So you would answer that by saying, is that true that there's no truth? Because you're self-refuting it already. So you're
Mm,
assuming that it's true that there's no
that there
truth,
is no truth.
right. So it falls on its face. So we all almost like we not almost we do we presuppose truth in everything we do, decision making in science. There's a presupposition in science that truth is good to go after, that it's good to go after truth. That's not a scientific claim, that's a philosophical claim. So truth is the foundation of everything we do. Now in that episode with that guest that I had, we were talking about where is truth grounded, right? Because a lot of people want to say, oh well, my feelings are truth. But if you really root your feelings as being true, I mean, we all could admit that we feel things that are just flat out wrong. And if we always acted on our impulse, I mean, I could speak for myself only, my life would be a
100%.
disaster, right? You
Absolutely.
need to ground yourself in reason that
Yep.
corresponds to truth. It doesn't mean your feelings are bad. It just means you need to put your feelings in check. But the
Right.
question is, put your feelings in check to what? And that would be
Right.
truth.
Right.
So what we were dealing with on that episode, and I just found so profound, is that objective truth or universal truth, reality in itself, has to be grounded in something real and objective, not something that changes. And what Christians ground that in is in God. Truth comes from God. It's God's truth. Everything true is of God. So we could always root, that's our standard. We can root our beliefs back to that. If you don't have God, that's where it gets tricky, because now where do you ground truth? Is it in society? Is it in evolution? Is it in, your feelings? Again, these are all shortcomings that all change. Society changes. The whole concept of evolution is change over time, right? So that changes all the time. And then your feelings change. So truth is a serious concept that we need to address. And if, just before I hand it back to you,
Mhm.
when you're having conversations with a skeptic, if you're not on the same page as to what truth is, it's going to be really hard to further the conversation, right? Because we believe Christianity is true in the most real sense, like gravity is true. But if they don't even believe in absolute truth or objective truth, then you're already going off the wrong foot. You're already going to be separated and you're going to have a hard time relating in some way or another. So sometimes you have to step all the way back and just agree that truth exists and it's good to seek after truth, and then you move forward from there.
Mm, mm. No, it's good. I find it still that a lot of people still get hung up on just the idea. Well, they'll say, well, that's your truth. Of which, my argument would be, um, I don't know if it quite works like that because again, just like you said, the only way for like, do you truly believe that? Do you believe that that is true? Do you believe that my truth is in fact true? And if so, like, we just like you said, we have to deal with the philosophical first, if you will, or just the idea, this definition, this defining of truth, in order to get anywhere. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know.
Well, then
It's a
everything
challenge.
becomes relative, right? Everything is relative to the person. So even the concept of truth that they're raising is not something I need to take seriously. Like if they say truth is relative to the person,
Right.
I don't
Then
have
what
to
are we
take that
talking about?
seriously at all,
Right.
right? Because
Right.
that's just
Right.
your opinion. That's like if I'm
Correct.
going to argue and die on the hill of chocolate ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream, you're going to
Right.
say, who cares? Like it doesn't, it
Right.
has no
Right.
impact on me. So if you're saying this is, my truth and your truth, those are just mere opinions on flavors of ice cream to me. And
Yeah.
it really falls apart when reality clicks in. There was a really, and I'm going to mess up this story, but you mentioned
Hmm.
Frank Turk, so it got brought to mind. He, in his
Hmm.
book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, I believe it's in that book. There's a story that he told, and it was about a professor, a philosophy professor, who had a student who was writing a paper on relativism about how morality is relative. So right and wrong depends on the person. There's not some objective standard. And he wrote the paper and he submitted it, and he submitted it in a blue folder or something of that sort. And the professor put a big F on it and said, "I don't like the color blue." And the
Mm.
student was like, "That's so unfair. Like, that's not right. That's
Right.
wrong." And the
Right.
professor was like, "Wait, I thought morality was relative because
Right.
that's my truth. And you're
Mm.
you're saying I'm wrong on what
Mm.
standard?" So it
Mm.
falls apart when you live it out in reality. And again, the most simple way of looking at truth is that in which corresponds to reality. So we really have to. It's a great point to address, and there's so much work has been done. Jeff Myers, I believe his name is, at Summit Ministries, has
Hmm.
written a great book. I believe it's called "What Is Truth." It's back there somewhere.
Okay.
But he has done a fantastic job of just breaking down what truth is, because we live in a really relativistic world where feelings have become people's gods and feelings have become the source of all truth. And the other side of that, which Christian apologists often make the mistake of doing, is
Hmm.
they focus so much on objective and absolute truth that they think there's no meaning to feelings. And we're not saying that. Feeling like if you're hungry, it's still true that you're hungry. Like that doesn't go away. But you have to root it in something true to reality, that you do have a desire to be hungry. Your body is seeking after this nutrition and so forth. So you root it all the way back down to the grounding of that truth. So it's a very important issue that we have to address, this commonality with our skeptic friends.
And how would you say that someone should go down a path of truth, right? Of seeking out truth. Because the question oftentimes gets raised, well, you're a Christian because you were born in the States. But if you grew up in Ramadi or, somewhere in the Middle East, then like by all means you would have, taken your Shahada and, you would be Muslim. Or if you grew up in the middle of somewhere in Africa, you would maybe be a part of some of, maybe the local religions there or so forth. How does one, and that's where I think, and I think that people are oftentimes being sincere when they're like, hey, look, so truth is relative. They're like, look, this guy who grew up in let's just stick with the Middle East and Muslim. This guy who grew up in the Middle East, like he didn't have a chance. He never heard the gospel, or like he never heard it in any significant way. Maybe he heard it in passing, like he saw a sign on a billboard or something once, and like, is he going to be held accountable to that? And so they said, well, look, so therefore truth is relative.
Mm.
What do you think about that as far as someone's exploration of truth?
Yeah, so the idea of not hearing the gospel, I think that's a separate but important issue, really important
Hmm.
issue. But the whole, like, you were raised, and that comes up so much. You were raised in a Christian household, that's why you're a Christian. Or, if you were raised in the Middle East, you'd be a Muslim. That just falls under the genetic fallacy, which is saying, this is only true because of where you come from or because of who you are. But facts and truth does not depend on where you live or depends on who you are. You could grow up you could be a Muslim because your family grew up Muslim, and Islam could still be false. In the same way, it's like there's arguments of saying like, oh, that person's the worst, the worst kind of person. Therefore, what they're saying is false. But you could still be the worst person and say true things, right? So you don't want to commit any logical fallacies, and that's kind of where I think would be the best way to go about this is a lot of times we're taught what to think in school, in public school, right? I think you went to public school,
Hmm.
so did I, right? And we were taught what to think, evolution, all these things. But very rarely do schools teach how to think. And I think that's really important because then you start getting into the logic of things. And that's another presupposition. Logic is something that's built into reality. We don't teach it, but we know it. We know that a square cannot be a circle. We know that a married man cannot be a bachelor. It's one or the other. It's the law of non contradiction, right? So when we start learning how to think, and this bleeds into where I think you might be going into like all the different religions and how do you know which one is true, we start mapping out, okay, well, if they contradict, then that can't be true. And
Right. They
then
can't all be true.
right. And then truth becomes exclusive by necessity, because for something to be true means something else has to be false, or else it's not true at all. It's just there. Right. So, and I'll go into this if you want, but, when you look at all the world religions, um, everyone will say, oh, they all could be coexist, right? You've seen that bumper sticker of
Hmm.
some sort. The issue is, yes, they have similarities, but they have significant differences. And it's almost like if I gave you a white pill, two white pills, and one would save your life and one would kill you, and they looked identical. Yeah, sure, the similarities are there. They're two white pills, they look the same, but the difference is really much more significant, right? They matter much more. And the same thing is true with religion. Like, yes, there's similar religions, but they contradict in major ways. For example, most Buddhist beliefs or sects of Buddhism don't believe in a God at all. That would completely contradict with the theistic beliefs that do believe in a God. Um, and even if you just break out from the world religions and stick within the ones that believe in one God, Muslim, Judaism, Christianity, they all disagree and contradict on who Jesus is, right? The Muslims believe that Jesus did not die
Right.
and
It
therefore did
was
not rise
switched at
again.
the end. Right.
Right. The Jews believe that he did die but did not rise again, and Christians believe that he did die and rose again. They all can't be true. So that's a significant difference. And if that didn't happen, if Jesus did not die and raise again, then Christianity is false. So it has significant implications. So we have to be careful to not overemphasize the similarities, like helping your brother, helping the poor, being nice to people. Okay, we get that. That's a similarity and that's all good. But the differences matter a lot more, and that's what we need to focus on when we're seeking truth. So when people ask, why are you a Christian, and I've told you this recently, I will say I believe in Christianity. I believe Christianity is true because it best explains reality. It explains the way the world really is, including what happened to Jesus Christ nearly 2,000 years ago, because that has to be explained. So when you're searching for truth, it has to go along with the way the world really works.
Right. And let's push at that, and we can keep it super top line, right? But it's like somebody's going to argue and say, you weren't there 2,000 years ago. Like
Hmm.
all that you know is something that somebody else told you, something that you read in a book, or so forth. Because what we don't want to do is is say, well, I know it's true because this is how I feel. And it's like, okay, well, then everybody, in their own individual ideologies and belief systems, they say, well, this is how I feel. So seeing that you weren't there, how, and again, we can keep it top line. I know there's like, you know, years of study on this topic, but
Yeah.
any top line thoughts for somebody just wrestling with that?
It's really important. It's an important issue. And, we also did an episode with Dr. Ben Shaw on how we can know history. And that was a really important topic, but it's big, right? You weren't there. So how do you know that Jesus rose again? Well, I also wasn't there when George Washington was president, but I have confidence beyond reasonable doubt that he indeed existed and was the first president of the United States. Now, the question becomes why for both issues, Jesus and George Washington. I wasn't there for either of them. But what we do is we go to the historical sources. What's the history? What's the historical support for these two people? And when you look at the historical support for the existence of Jesus, it far outweighs all of the ancient historical sources or people that we have, like Plato and Socrates, and you name it, Caesar, you name all these people that we know throughout history. They doesn't even come close as far as his historical support for the New Testament, which is the accounts of Jesus. And Frank
And
Turek, he
that's
keeps coming up. Oh, go ahead.
and that's based heavily in the manuscripts, if I understand it correctly. Like the manuscripts representing the number of people writing, books, or if you will, but writing about this. Is that a correct assessment?
So a manuscript would be a copy. So it's
Mm-hmm.
so not people, but mainly copies. So one person could have written 50 manuscripts, let's say, because we don't. The reality is, and people like to go crazy when they hear this, especially skeptics. But we don't have the originals of the New Testament, and they'll usually, oh, look at that, you don't have the originals. Well, the reality is we don't have the originals of anything, of any ancient source. They're all manuscripts and copies. And what we're doing is, we're looking at a couple things. How many copies do we have? And then how far were these copies written from the originals? So we're looking at dating. And I believe it was the most recent one I did with Dr. Ben Shaw was, can we trust the New Testament? So I want to direct our listeners for a more in-depth answer to that episode
100%.
because we really
100%.
break it down. But really what we're looking at is we have at least 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and that's only in the original language of Greek. If you add in the other languages, you're looking at about 26,000 manuscripts. And you might say, oh, Jake, okay, that sounds a lot, but I'm sure the others are close to it. Not even close. I think the most in competition in that is maybe 1,000 manuscripts, and about like 400 years to 1,000 years out as far as dating goes. So the number of manuscripts does not even compare. And then I was just mentioning in dating, people date, the New Testament books different ways. Some date late, some date early. Either
And
way you look at it.
when you say date, you're saying the age of the manuscript versus the time of it happening,
So
or
that's a
the
great
age of
point.
the writing versus the time of it happening. Is that
So when it was originally written, right? So the earliest manuscript we have is about, I think, maybe 130 AD, something of that sort, within the first, second century. But that's just the manuscript. That's not the original. So by manuscript, it implies that it was copied from something else. So whatever that something else was must have predated that manuscript. So it has to be earlier than that. And what scholars do is they collect all of these manuscripts. And this is why having more is good, because you could collect the more and then reconstruct the original and then look at the text. It's called textual criticism. You look at the language that was used, the punctuation, the historical setting in comparison to our archaeological data that we have. So you're comparing a whole bunch of things to get an estimate of when the original was written beyond
Mhm.
reasonable doubt. So not just like
Mhm.
wishful thinking, but like a reasonable estimate. And, like I said, some people date the New Testament Gospels to, early first century, late first century. Either way, it's first century within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. And that's the most important thing
Right? I was
because
gonna
we're
say, and
looking
this is
for
in
eyewitness.
contrast, right? Contrast to, like, say, some of the other writings. We're talking about hundreds of years. Like, all the eyewitnesses were good and dead at that point.
Yeah, I think the best, and this is just going off memory, I think the
Hmm.
best is Homer, the account of
Hmm.
Homer, which is like
Hmm.
400 years from the original. And that's good. But what we have, right, is you could go back to 26 years after Jesus is that original writing. But then you could go back even further, which is mind blowing. And if you go to 1 Corinthians 15, um, in the beginning of that chapter, you have what is known as an early church creed. So it was, Paul says this was passed down to him. So again, that implies he got it from somewhere. And it literally lays out the gospel and who Jesus appeared to: people, individuals, groups of people, believers, non believers, and he appeared to them in a resurrected state. Atheist scholars, such as Gerd Ludman, have dated it within a couple years from when Jesus died. And then another scholar, his name is escaping me, dated it to within a couple months from when Jesus died. So if you're saying the best secular historical source we have is in terms of dating is 400 years, and we're going in within months of Jesus, I mean, that's just unbelievable. So
And so the argument with that is that, how do I put it? Somebody wouldn't, like, this wouldn't get that far. This truth wouldn't spread, or this idea, if you will, wouldn't spread, because it doesn't have enough time to become conspiracy. So in other words, if I said that so and so specifically did a certain thing, and these people were there and these people were there, because these people were still in fact alive, it it gives the opportunity for somebody to easily refute it and say this didn't happen. One of the things that comes up, I think about a lot as far as the faith, and even some of the hurdles that I think that, like, non-believers have, is they think about our world today and assume that it was like this, 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago, for that matter. Jake, you and I were just talking yesterday, and I was laughing at your age because you didn't know this, but that, there was a time where you could walk all the way up to the airport gate, to the terminal, even if you didn't have a ticket. And you were like, yeah, I didn't know that, or whatever. And it's like, well, that's because that didn't really happen in your lifespan of time. It did in mine. I did have people walk me up to the gate and so forth. Bringing that back to this, you know we think of Christianity today, especially living in the States, and we're like, oh, okay, it's kind of a big deal. We have, even taking Christianity away, we have in God we trust on our money. Like, it's not uncommon for prayer to happen at, like a baseball game or just different things. And so we're like, oh, okay, I get it. I get how this Christianity thing works. You guys have always been on top. You guys have always been significant. You guys have always been in places of influence. So therefore, you were able to put together this whole conspiracy concoction of a book. But the reality of it is, that's not how it was. It couldn't have been any further than the truth. Any thoughts on that?
yeah, you mentioned before about legend, like legend creeping in. Scholars have found that on average, it takes about like 350 to 400 years for legend to start creeping in into the text. And what's really interesting is we have legendary accounts of Jesus and the gospel. It's just not in the Bible because it's obviously a
Correct.
legendary account. I think it's called the Gospel of Peter, where Jesus walks out of the tomb, or the tomb, it's the cross has a head that extends to the sky, I believe is what it says in it. So just like certainly legendary, written much later, like second, third century. And you could contrast that with the Gospel of Mark, which is very simple. Nothing even crazy happening in that. I mean, he
Right.
is
Right.
calming the
Relatively
waters and doing
speaking.
all these, yeah, right, relatively to a cross extending to the sky, right?
Right.
But it's a very simple historical account. So that alone shows a contrast between what legend looks like and what history looks like, ancient history looks like. Um, Now, you were also touching. Remind me, what else were you implying there on
Uh,
that question?
yeah, I was talking about just how people will look at Christianity today,
Mm,
especially here in America, and just
all right.
assume that, like, oh, okay, yeah, you guys have always been in places of influence, and it's just like, it's just not the reality. Like, Christians were on the run. Christians were being, persecuted, beheaded, killed. thrown into boiling oil, all sorts of things. And again, I get the challenge of how hard that is to grasp. And I even get the challenge of somebody saying, well, you know, you're getting your history from a book. You weren't there, you don't know. And like you said, and we even wrote some articles on this, but the reality is that's where we get pretty much all of our information from. We look for, going back to your original point, what is the best explanation of reality and what we see around us? It's like, well, you weren't there, you don't know. And it's like, well, I just rode over a bridge the other day too. Like, I had nothing to do with the construction of that. I don't know who made it. I don't know. You get the concept?
Oh, absolutely. And there's two things that I want to mention. One thing is you mentioned this, the disciples' willingness to die is a massive point in this in seeing the truth of Christianity, because the
But all,
eyewitnesses.
all religions have martyrs. So what's your pushback on that?
That's perfect. So all religions have martyrs, but this is where it differs with Christianity, is that the eyewitnesses were martyrs. So me and you, we could die for the faith, and that would be equivalent to a Muslim who dies for their faith, because we're dying for what we think is true. We're dying
Right.
trusting that. The
Right.
apostles, though, the followers of Jesus, they were willing to die for what they would have known to be false if it didn't happen. And people do not die for a lie that they
100%.
know to be a lie. They know if they know it didn't happen, they're not going to die for it, because why would they? What do they gain from
Correct.
that? And that
Correct.
not only that, but they had to suffer, they had to go through persecution, homelessness. They were definitely sought out for, as you mentioned, with all
Yep.
those brutal ways of
Yep.
dying. So it's a really key point. And a lot of people, when I say this, are like, what about the Muslims? They die for their faith all the time. So that's why I kind of qualified it with that, is
Yeah,
these
100%.
apostles would have known if Jesus truly rose again or not. And if they were going on this lie for whatever reason, the atheist would have to propose a reason.
Hmm.
Then, I mean, it's just very hard to believe that they'd be willing to die for that.
Absolutely. And
So
and
it's a very,
they didn't die together just in one shot. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, you heard about this guy dying, you heard about this guy dying. At some point, again, if we're just looking at the world and assuming that the world is logical and it shows reality, at some point somebody's going to say, like, all right, you know what, the gig is up. Whatever we thought we were going to achieve by this apparently is not working, because we all keep dying. Like, we're moving on.
but
Unless.
also there's non-believers too, right? Like James
Mm,
and Paul. James was not a
mm,
believer, and
mm,
then he became a believer, a leader of the church, and then was martyred, or at
mm,
least was willing to be martyred. Then Paul, the
mhm,
same thing. Paul was executing Christians
mm,
publicly, like
mm.
persecuting them to death, and then he became a believer, and then he was willing to be martyred for his death. So what in the world would explain that? And I just don't think a lie would do that, because
100%.
James and Paul
100%.
already thought it was a lie.
Correct. Correct. And what made it so nice, again, from the eyes of a skeptic, like, God never asked us to be dumb or whatever, like, ever.
Mhm.
And so, like, these weren't things that happen in secret, or happen in a cave, no shade or whatever. But these were very public happenings that could be very easily verified, refuted, so forth, for us to, be able to believe in and find faith in.
So the whole idea of faith and reason not working together or not being compatible is such a myth. It's such a
Yeah.
misconception. I've said this before, but faith is trusting in what you have good reasons to believe, and I think there is immense reasons to believe in Christianity. Um, One more thing, though, I wanted to point out. You mentioned the West and
Please.
how, like, we live in the West, and we have, in God we trust on our dollar bills. The Constitution's full of the creator being mentioned and biblical
Right.
principles, right? So we're seeing all
Right.
of this. What's interesting is we have to ask ourselves, where did these principles come from? Right? Like, where did they come from to begin with? And they came from Christianity, biblical principles, Judeo-Christianity. Actually, everything we have in the West that we appreciate, modern science, is due to Christian influence. You look at Isaac Newton, who wrote more theology than he did science. And that's just
Mhm.
one scientist of many You look at the education system, even how we're literate today is because of the spread of training people to read scriptures. That's why we're literate in the West. And by the way, going back to modern science, there's a reason why modern science developed in the West and not the East. It's because
Mm.
Christianity was flourishing in the West. Right. So they had this idea of, wow, there's a way the world works because there's a law maker, there's a designer, and we want to seek after that mind. But then you look at slavery. Abolitionists were mainly Christian. Now you could say, right, there was Christian who abused that and used the
Sure.
Bible to support
Sure.
slavery, but I would say they're in the same boat as abortionists today who try and twist scripture to support
Correct.
abortion, right?
Correct.
There's some bad apples out there, but still the abolitionists were primarily going off of the premise, including Reverend Martin Luther King, that all human beings are made in God's image. So
Right.
you have all these great things that we're used to, that we love, that we appreciate, and then we don't even ask, or maybe we're ignorant to, where do they come from?
Right. Well,
And the
you don't even think about it because it's so just built into daily life, society, all the things. Even something as simple as universities, hospitals. You know what I mean? It's like you look at the name of these older universities, hospitals, St. Joseph's Hospital, all these different things, and it's like, no, these are Christian based institutions,
and the
as
pushback
opposed
we'll get
to
from that. Oh no, go ahead.
please. No, after you.
No, I was just gonna say, and the pushback to that typically is, oh well, what about the Crusades, and what about when like Christians supported slavery, and all these like one-offs where these Christians were bad actors, right? And I like what Frank Turek said in one of his books. He says this a lot, but he says, "Have you ever heard a Led Zeppelin cover band?" And they'd be like, "Yeah." And you say, "What if they really just stunk? If they did horrible, would you conclude then that Led Zeppelin's a really bad band?" You'd be like, no, it was just the cover band didn't do what it was supposed to do. It didn't meet to its standard. In the same way,
100%.
there's Christians, in quotes, who act in a way and try and slap the Jesus label on it, but that does not have any impact on the truth or the teachings of Christianity. So it's a
Right.
big difference we have to make.
Yeah, and I think the teachings are just, I think that was a great example. I think the teachings are so incredibly true in a sense of like, okay, well, even we take slavery, we take the Crusades, and it's just like, okay, no problem. Just show me where it mandates that they should have done this in the Bible, and then
Mm-hmm.
and now it's time to challenge it. But you can't find it. You know what I mean? Okay, did somebody twist something? But it was very obvious that they twisted these things for their own motives.
I might
There's
have
some
said
of
this
us
on
who
our last call. They said, I may have said this on our last
go ahead.
interview, that one of the arguments to support slavery from Bible was that it doesn't say verbatim that black people had souls. That's just a foolish argument, right? Because it
100%.
obviously is that all human beings are made in the image of
Correct.
God. So right off the
Correct.
bat, you could see that it's just a
Correct.
completely foolish argument.
Yep. It doesn't say the disciples used the restroom, so it's just like, they didn't go. They didn't go. Safe to assume it.
Yeah,
100%.
that's good.
100%. 100%. No, this has been good. Any other thoughts that come to mind kind of on this topic as we, I guess, get ready to wrap up?
I mean, just seek after, these things. These are some significant issues that we just really quickly, briefly went
100%.
over, truth and the Bible's evidence for its historicity, all the religions out there. These are all topics that have been talked about for hours and lectures, and books have been written on them. Um, but the one thing I want to really, articulate to our listeners is, do not be afraid to dive into them. Don't be afraid to
Yes.
dive into these issues, because
Yes.
there's ways that it could come off as intimidating when someone says, "Oh, you believe that only your religion is true over all the others," and that's intimidating to hear, because you don't want to be a bad person. You're trying to be a good person, but at the same time, you want to be reasonable and you want to believe what is true. So you really want to have a good answer to that. And one good answer to that is, well, I believe Christianity is true and you don't. Do you therefore believe that all Christians are wrong? And they're probably going to say, yeah, you're wrong. So either way, we're going to get true and false. So we want to have good reasons for what we believe. So go after those issues. The other thing I would say is really, pay attention to the details of how people are thinking. I mentioned this earlier. I personally wasn't taught logic and how to think, but if you can, get a book on philosophy and start training yourself on these logical arguments. I think it's called The Philosophical Foundation of a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. It's a dense book. It's like you could knock someone dead with that thing, but it has a ton of information, including a chapter on logic. And I've been trying to read that like repetitively, just going over it again and again, because it's one thing to know what to think. It's another thing to know how to think. So we want to, really make sure that that's straight and narrow. But that's really all I had. I think this is a good convo, Steve.
Yeah, no, indeed. And, more to come for sure. And, we definitely open a door for any of listeners as well. Like if you have specific questions, specific topics and things that you want to address, like we'd be happy to address it. I always say, especially when talking to my kids, I challenge them about their faith. I say, well, why do you believe that? And they're like, I don't know. The person in Sunday school told me. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to work or whatever. I'm like, well, what about this? What about that? And the reality of it is that, truth and things that are real, like it's like gold, right? Like they say that you just, you can't get rid of it. It's a pure thing. I'm struggling with what I'm trying to say. The point I'm trying to get at is when it comes to truth, and when it comes to God, right? It's like if he's legit, if he's real, if he's all powerful, if he's all knowing, and all the things that we claim that he is, then he can handle any of the questions that we have. He can handle any of the pushback that we have. He can handle any of the things that we're just like, man, that really doesn't make sense. And I do think that the vast majority of the questions can be answered. And then I do think that there will be some questions that it's like, man, that's a struggle. I'm not really sure, and that's biblical. Paul even talked about like, he talked about this pain of suffering that he was dealing with. And he's like, well, Lord, can't you just take it away? And the Lord didn't, and he said like, look, you're going to carry this. But as it pertains to this, I think that there are a lot of our questions that we can answer, that we can get answered, that we can research, that we can make sense of. When it comes to our faith, and we just encourage pursuing the pushing of that, the unwrapping of that, because trust me, if you don't do it, somebody else will, and they'll cause you to have doubts in your faith because they maybe have a motive to try to take you in a certain direction. I'm saying take the gloves off yourself and really try to understand your faith. So that would be my thoughts as we close it out. Anything else on your end, Jake?
No, it's so good. I appreciate that, Steve.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate you guys tuning in to this episode. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next one. Again, don't forget, feel free to post any questions you guys have. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
God bless, guys.